What a week it has been, not just for the Call of Duty scene, but for the entire world, as everything from schools to professional sports leagues have all been canceled or put on hold due to COVID-19, the pandemic that is COVID-19. Today on our launch episode, we'll be talking on how COVID has in fact affected the future of the CDL, which teams to look out for heading into the newly announced online league, as well as Faze's unforeseen loss at CDL Los Angeles. All that and more ahead on Off the Break. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Off the Break. I'm Lando Sanders, and welcome inside the Frontier Communications studio from Dallas, Texas. We welcome you inside the studio, wishing you all health and safety during this time. Now, getting straight into things, I want to rewind the clock back a little bit to the Los Angeles Homestand, because coming into this new online atmosphere, it provides a lot of new discussion, right? That discussion comes from what took place at CDL LA. And one of the biggest tales to look out for heading into the newly announced online league is where Faze's headspace is right now, because I believe that Atlanta's loss to Minnesota was the best thing that could have happened to them. Because I want to keep in mind, Faze leading up into their series versus Minnesota were 8-0 in series, 24-4 in maps. They had 3-0 teams in 5 out of their 8 series, and they had 3-1 teams in 2 out of those 8 series. The only one that had seen a Game 5 leading up into their rematch versus Minnesota was versus the Rocker in Atlanta, in a series that Minnesota should have closed out, considering the fact that they were up, considering the fact that the ball was in their court. Now, I believe that near loss for Faze definitely scared them, but it did not do enough to make them feel vulnerable. Because Faze goes on, right, to win their home series, 3-0 Florida, doing the exact same thing when it comes down to LA as well, 3-0 Florida again. But the near loss is simply all an afterthought at this point, right? It's completely in the rearview mirror at this point, because like I said, they head into LA and it is business as usual. Taking down Florida, like I said, 3-0. Taking down Dallas, 3-0, to finally face off against the team that caused them problems, the only team that has caused them problems up until this season, the Minnesota Rocker. And we all know the story. For those that haven't got a chance to, it was an unbelievable series. I recommend you go back and watch it, with 2 of what I believe to be the smartest teams in all of the CDL. It was a mind game of straight back and forth. You rotate, I rotate, you flip spawns, I flip spawns. We see an unbelievable end to a hard point, and Minnesota manages to take the final 2 maps. Now, the reason why I focus so much on this series is because it finally made Faze feel vulnerable, right? The Atlanta Faze were shown that they are, in fact, human. Despite all the tweets and Reddit threads, all the tweets that I got saying this team may be incapable of losing. This may be for the first time ever in Call of Duty history that a team kind of goes throughout the season and doesn't lose a single series. And what happens? They finally do. And you know what? I'm actually pretty happy about it. Why? Because after CDL Atlanta, there was no question who the best team in the world was. Heading into Atlanta, there was conversation, right? I mean, many people ranked Chicago very, very highly, as we had yet to see Faze in a full tournament setting. And what happened? Chicago came out and looked flat, almost all event long. Right? They went Game 5, Round 11 versus Toronto. That is pretty much a team that is not even close to being on the same level as them. They look shaky at times throughout a series, especially in hardpoint versus Minnesota, suffering the worst hardpoint loss yet in the CDL up to that point in game number 1. They get reverse swept by Florida, which granted, Florida on the day looked great, but in the first 2 games, it was also very close and could have gone Florida's way as well. A few situations go differently, and that is a 5-0 for the Mutineers. You suffer what was rather, you actually win the hardpoint game in game 1 by 9 points. You win the search and destroy 6 rounds to 4. And the losses that you suffer, right, the next 3 games, they weren't close. 40-point loss in the Dom, 64-point loss in the hardpoint, a 6-2 in the search and destroy, especially considering that you looked like one of the best teams post-London. And at that point, the comparisons, at least for me, were over. Chicago was part of getting reverse swept. Atlanta was part of reverse sweeping. The only team at that time that could even be compared to FaZe was Huntsman. And after Atlanta, there were no more questions. Everything that Atlanta had worked toward in the preseason was in some ways accomplished, right? Outside of what is going to be the world championship aspirations for the future, everything was accomplished and in record time. Be the best team considered in the game. Check. To look consistent in all game modes. Check. To have consistency across the team and individually. Check. To be the most well-communicated team. Check. And to win the first event they play at their home market. Check. This team needed to be shaken up a little bit. And even though they've really only had problems with one team, I think for this particular group, it's enough. I do. I think this is enough to light the fire again. It's enough for them to feel like they always have to cover their tracks, because in interviews they had talked about it leading up into their rematch series versus Minnesota. Guys like Abizi, guys like Major Maniac were very conscious of the fact that, hey, we have to be aware of the teams that are hunting us down. And now they realize, like I said, that they're vulnerable, because this is a team that I hope for the future doesn't get checked with egos. And I know that conversation is early, and there's a term that I'm getting ready to use that is far too early for them as well. But they're a young, mature core that has a great coaching staff, and I truly believe that they have a chance down the line, and be careful with this word, they have capability to be a dynasty. And now I don't use that term lightly. I think this is probably the only time that I have used this term for a team outside of what we've seen from, obviously, the Optic Dynasty, outside of what we saw from the Cole/EG Dynasty. I truly believe that this team has the capability to maybe get there. I'm not saying they're there by any means, but this is the thing that is very, very important for me because of the ego checks that have happened early. At the start of the season, I said FaZe, they won the offseason because they're not only prepared for this year, they are prepared for next year, the year after that, and the year after that. For the next 2, 3, 4 seasons, these guys could technically stay together if they wanted to. They have a team that can be competitive and that can stay together long term. But for any lineup, they will at times run into, like every other team has, internal problems. And like every other dynasty has, not calling them a dynasty, but if they have aspirations of getting there, of which I think are possible, they're going to have to deal with this. Because how has every dynasty ended? It isn't because they start to fall off. It isn't because the skill isn't there. It's because of internal problems. It's because of struggles. Even talking about the Farico Impact Dynasty, talk about the Optic Dynasty, talking about the Cole/EG Dynasty. Every single one of those ended because of internal problems. Now, this loss and losses throughout the season, I believe, are healthy for the Atlanta Faze because it never allows for them to be comfortable. Now, I'm a basketball guy, and I'm not sure how familiar all of you may be with the 1992 Dream Team. But long story short, the 1992 Dream Team was an Olympic basketball team composed of some of the greatest players of all time. It's regarded as the greatest basketball team ever assembled. However, the problem that this team dealt with early was working together. I watched the documentaries. They talked about how the team would pass the ball too much. Some guys wouldn't pass the ball at all. Egos became a problem. People had to get checked when it came down to practice. And the legendary Coach Daly at practice decided when the U.S. men's Olympic team faced off against some of the best college players that he was going to throw the game. He did. The Dream Team lost, and it was bad, and it was embarrassing. And from that point on, the Dream Team knew, okay, we can be vulnerable. We have to work together. We aren't immortal, right? We have the ability to lose. We have the ability to lose at any moment. And when they went to the Olympics, they put on one of the most dominant performances in sports history. Now, again, let me be clear with this. I'm not saying the Atlanta Faze are the Dream Team of Call of Duty. obviously. But the same aspect can apply, right? For a team that has all the ability in the world, all the capability in the world, losses for a team of this caliber and for a team this young is healthy, especially to light their fire. This is a team that now knows not only are they looking at teams in the rearview mirror, but those teams can gain on them and have the ability to pass them now heading into the online league. And again, I'm happy that they had a loss, especially before the online league takes place, because fans and even FaZe themselves would have always put an asterisk over every loss that they'd have online. Because if a team comes in and say, hey, we haven't lost on LAN yet, they lose online, doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. It's not even all that important because, hey, we talk about LAN, it's more important than online. These guys are still in some ways undefeated in my book. That's the way that it would have translated. But speaking of the online league, in case you haven't heard, the CDL did make a statement this past Thursday saying the health and safety of employees, fans, players, teams, and partners is paramount to Activision Blizzard Esports. We are continuing to closely monitor COVID-19 city-level recommendations and mandates and all guidelines set forth by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. After careful review and working in close collaboration with our teams, we are shifting all currently shifted 2020 Call of Duty League live events to online-only competition, effective immediately. For details on previously ticketed events, please visit host team websites and follow their social channels. The new online-only matches we broadcast live to fans. Dates will be announced shortly, along with tune-in details. Call of Duty League has seen firsthand the power of our live events in our inaugural season and will return to city-based competition in front of live audiences as soon as it's safe and logistically possible. In the interim, Call of Duty League is confident it will continue to deliver fans what they want, amazing competition between the best players competing at the highest level for the right to be considered the greatest team on Earth. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't really all that shocked by the release. I saw quite a few people commenting that this was not the right time to do it. They should have put the CDL on pause, much like a lot of other sports leagues, and resumed later. However, that isn't logistically possible, right? This is the only direction you could have gone with this. From an event perspective, renting out these spaces is a very large scale operation. You've got a ton of moving pieces, from location to staff to players to audience, vendors, etc. The list goes on. Booking events and venues is done months in advance, and the weight and pressure of canceling an event last second is worth avoiding at all costs, especially if you don't want to go in the red. Now, you have to be careful, though, in the wording with this one here in the release. And I may be jumping on something that doesn't necessarily exist, but in the press release it does say, and I quote, "It will return to city-based competition in front of live audiences as soon as it is safe and logistically possible." Earlier in the statement, it also explains that they are currently shifting all scheduled live events to online competition. But in my opinion, this is realistically keeping the door open for champs. I think that's what this is. I think the wording kind of makes it seem as if that's the case because, and we didn't know the exact dates of champs, but you'd like to assume it would be after the last event in Toronto, would be around the time of July. Champs was supposed to take place, at least in my eyes, in July. Obviously, we're learning more about the virus daily, but there are currently a lot of reports talking about July being the time where many things could start to resume. Keeping in mind that is what currently we know. Things could change, obviously. But that's just kind of where my head is as of right now. I think a very solid majority of the season will be online. However, if things do go the way they sound like it and based off experts' opinions, champs is still a very real possibility to be on LAN, because online it wouldn't be the greatest situation, obviously, and I think that would be a totally different conversation that we would have if that happens to be the case. Now, all that we currently know, and based on the rumored format released by Slasher, which I'll read a little bit of, is that Activision Blizzard is currently working with team owners across the CDL and OWL to possibly reschedule games throughout the week, although he does go on to mention that nothing as of now has been finalized. You know, it really is a shame because I loved the format that we were doing with the CDL. I really started to have worries not long after the original schedule was released because event-based tournaments were announced and it was solely league matches, I just felt like they really nailed it. And I think that even other esports are going to, in the future, look at what the CDL did and say, you know what, that may be the system to adapt to. Even regular sports leagues. NBA has talked about for the longest of time, and as of recently, been saying, hey, you know what? It'd be kind of cool if we had a mid-season tournament, right? It'd be very cool if we kind of did that. And there's been a lot of speculation that maybe in the future that could be something that they adapt to, especially if their season is put on pause for a very long time. But like I said, I just feel like they really nailed it, and it is unfortunate, the fact that obviously everything kind of has to be put on pause for right now and have to go to an online league format, of which we're still waiting to hear what exactly occurs with that. But I'll be real with you, and we can touch on this more at a later time as information is revealed more, but I worry about the logistics of this change, fully in realization that this was the only option that could have been really out there. But at first, just solely due to the publicity of a franchised esport being affected, it'll draw eyes, right? Everyone's at home. People are wanting to watch what has kind of been a very interesting subject matter as of recent. But I worry about the weight and the lack of excitement behind league matches. Because it would be different if we didn't have this before, right? It would be different if we didn't have a great format that was on LAN, in front of a venue crowd, for a championship. It would be different if something wasn't taken away. I just hope that the CDL was working to make sure that these future problems, or rather future changes, are properly addressed, because I just don't see the hype nor the excitement really being there. And I don't think that all these storylines as well are going to translate that well to an online league. We talked about the biggest storyline as of this moment, Atlanta Faze versus Chicago Huntsmen. Who wins that? What happens if it's just week 4 of a random pro league? It's not really all that weighty, right? There's not a championship on the line. There's not storylines really all coming into that. I mean, it'll be a hype match, don't get me wrong, but if it's a pro league game, it kind of sets the tone off a little bit. But the biggest deal with all of this, and the reason why online league matches are easier than, say, tournament online matches, that also could be a possibility, are online attacks. Right? If you have pretty much 2 days set apart like you did when it came down to LAN, what happens if you have to deal with online attacks, right? What happens if something goes down? Internet problems obviously arise. What happens then at that moment? Does the tournament get put on pause? What happens if matches have already occurred? A lot of problems could easily take place there. And this is something that needs to be addressed before the league fires back up, is we need, for the level of competition that we're going to see from LAN, the best way possible translate to online, meaning dedicated servers, better overall connection when it comes down to custom lobbies, protection against DDoS attacks, etc. The ability to pause games mid-match online for possible lagouts, things like that. Now, I'm sure pros, organizations have probably already addressed this to the league. This is something that instantly came into my mind, and obviously is going to affect those players, the organizations as well. Especially because we've gone through this previously with DDoS attacks, etc. But this has to be handled properly, right? You're going to have players scattered all throughout the United States. Precautions must be in play and properly addressed for the online league to be successful and for it to carry on what has previously been, which was a well-structured LAN tournament league. Now, I've also heard the recommendations of pre-recorded CDL matches, which actually sounds great in theory from a, I guess you could say from the CDL's point of view, but this is my problem with what could be pre-recorded matches, because we've had this discussion before in the past many years ago when online was a factor, but results could easily be leaked, right? Despite precautions being taken, this could allow for betting to obviously cause a problem when it comes into CDL matches, which is its own issue totally. It also kind of takes away from the live element. Eventually, if you try to act as if it's live, people are going to figure it out. You're going to have that one pro who accidentally turns on his live stream while he's playing a CDL match. You're going to have a pro accidentally tweet out a GIF or tweet something in the middle of a match. It's going to happen. There is no way that you can kind of get away from that. It will be leaked at some point if these are pre-recorded. And it's going to take away from the live element, right? The one thing that at least you have with online is that it's live. You get to watch the reactions in real time. You get to react with the rest of these players. You're feeling the emotions of what currently is taking place, and that goes away with matches that are pre-recorded. Now, there have been a lot of people talking about how they're excited to see things kind of go back to the old school feel of how Call of Duty used to be with the online league. But there is a reason why LAN was so heavily requested back in the day. I remember the tweets. I remember the Reddit threads. The requests every pro player had was just let the league be on LAN. Just allow the league to be played in a LAN environment. That is all we ask. I remember some players saying, I don't even care if it's a good game. Just put the league on LAN. And the idea of an online league, it kind of sounds cool. I get it. Right? I get the idea of changing things up a little bit. I understand it. Trust me, the right precautions and preparation need to be in play before we all get excited about this. Because if not, problems can start to occur. Because I worry that switching will affect the mentality of not just the fans, but for the players themselves. Granted, it is their only form of competition, but still the same applies. Also, let me address something, because I realize the online league, and I said it a minute ago, but I'll say it again, was the only option available. The idea of delaying the league until further notice, I don't believe would have been a sound one. It's an unfortunate circumstance that's simply, at this moment, unavoidable. I want the audience to know that as well, because players just can't play without a crowd. That still involves the idea of travel and puts people and players at risk, and that just can't happen. Well, I believe the online league by no means is the greatest alternative. It happens to be the only one that we have, and we have to make the best of it. And at the very least, we can in some ways be excited the fact that, hey, at least matches aren't canceled. At least the CDL still gets to go on. That's the beauty of esports. But it still in some ways is going to be hard to deal with. And a lot of precautions, like I said, need to be in place for this to be a successful thing. Because this affects a lot more than people think. It affects all the stuff we talked about on top of things like roster changes. In fact, we've already seen a few teams begin to make roster changes. The first coming through from New York, as they've officially signed Mac Meltz, who in my eyes was already targeted ahead of CDL Los Angeles, but for whatever reason couldn't be added in time for the event. But it's pretty much all but confirmed he'll be starting in place of Happy moving forward. Mac's been pretty much around since World War II and has been a very well-known player online for the last few years, and was most recently finishing second at CDL launch weekend under Hybrid Black. London as well, post CDL Los Angeles, have announced their newest signing in Nasty. Again, another player most likely being brought in for the starting lineup. It's still rumored that he will be taking the spot of previously rated. Nasty played Champs 2019 under Celtic FC Esports, finished 12th at launch weekend under Train Hard, and then finished second at the London Open, and then most recently in Paris, actually managed to win the Open event for Team War. So some interesting signings for sure, and ones that I'm personally very eager to see, because now and for the future of the online league, it actually makes roster changes a lot easier, and a lot of people aren't going to realize that, because travel no longer gets in the way. Scrimming schedules are already more open than they've ever been. Bringing in young talent, making roster changes are at an all-time high. Now, that's simply everyone's just at home, right? If you want to grab a player and he happens to be playing very well online, very easy to plug him in. Very easy to bring this guy about. It's not about having to time everything out. It's not about trying to be aware of this event that we have going on, trying to be aware of our homestand, all kinds of things. It is much more feasible to make moves happen. Events that would, like I said, normally get in the way of changes or delay player substitutions, it lessens now with the online environment. But in the midst of all these changes and soon to be changes, let's actually go ahead and take a quick look at my current power rankings as of right now. Now, I'll be honest with you, the term power rankings kind of bothers me a little bit. I've been on the record saying a lot about how power rankings at times can be inaccurate based on the definition of them. Reason being is that it's just such a loose term that normally involves specific stats along with little personal opinion. But let me be real with you. This list is strictly personal opinion, right? This is where I see if teams faced off the way that they looked in LA and Atlanta, where I see them at this current moment. We're not yet factoring in online play. This is what we have seen coming into the new online version of the league, which is obviously going to change things up a little bit. As much as we hate to say it, it will change things up nonetheless. So I'm going to kind of go in a little bit of an order here. I'm going to talk about a few teams that I kind of have on my list, who I think has the ability to raise, teams I think have the ability to lower, why I have certain teams placed where I do. Now, I've seen a few people in their power rankings talk about how the first spot is now undecided, right? It could be Chicago based on the way that Atlanta looked in their loss versus Minnesota. It very well could be Empire, as they just won Los Angeles, looking great in the midst of doing so. The reason why I have Faze where I do is that they are still atop the mountain in my book. They have only struggled with one team so far, and they've handled all the rest. Granted, Chicago and Faze have yet to play against one another. However, until we see Faze have problems elsewhere, this is where I see them staying for the near future. Talk about Empire a little bit. As much as I enjoyed their win and felt that did legitimize their decision they made to go with the young talent, right? Illy and Shotzi, especially Shotzi, looked fantastic at the event. I still have them here. A win is a win, but you also have to consider the fact that they still are 0-3 versus Chicago. They're still 0-2 versus Atlanta. And if we're looking on accomplishments so far throughout the season, Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago, they've all got wins so far this season. Now, taking a look a little bit, not too much farther down at Optic Gaming, this may be a little bit shocking for a few people visually, but like I said, this is a team, this is not based on placement so far throughout the year. This is not based on average. This is what I have seen. Just where I internally rank this team at the moment, I loved what I saw from Optic in LA. Despite the small sample size, what we saw was a different looking LA team. I like their chances for the future, and this was a team that I predicted to be very high as the season progressed. I thought that they would be off to a much harder start, or rather a hotter start than they have been so far throughout the league, but they have improved, and what they showed me in a very small sample size, I think is enough for the future. The roles, everything for me, it kind of makes sense. Next, we've got the Florida Mutineers. This is a team that I think has a lot of options right now, given their current circumstance, right? They have 4 guys who all stand a chance of getting 3 spots, in Havoc, Mox, Prasini, and Pharaoh. This team worries me, right, with consistency, but I believe has the ability to lower, has the ability to raise, maybe even depending on the team they put together. There's a lot of teams right now kind of getting rid of that second AR flex. That could be the opportunity for Mox to maybe get the pretty much get knocked outside the door. We talked about with New York. We talk about with London, kind of getting rid of that second AR player. This could be the same thing here for the Florida Mutineers and getting rid of Mox. Time will tell. I liked what I saw from Pharaoh when it came down to LA, and they seem to have a really good relationship with him as of right now. Another team that I want to touch on, which may be a little bit surprising for people because I feel like Paris could really be anywhere, kind of around this particular region. I know I have them a little bit lower than a lot of other people do, but it's just kind of the norm for me as of right now because I don't know how Paris is going to react to all these team changes that are going to come about. We talked about a lot of different rosters they're starting to raise. How does New York start to look? How does Seattle start to look if they end up making a change? How does this new looking Optic Gaming roster affect everyone else's placements or rather power rankings as well? This is a team in Paris that I believe has the ability to go up from here. I just haven't loved what I've seen from them recently. If you take away launch weekend, the only teams that they have beaten are Toronto twice and New York once. And that's it, right? That's the only teams that they have faced off and taken down so far as of yet. And I think that they've looked shaky on core mechanics of the game. I went through and I've watched a few of their matchups, especially versus Toronto, which is their most heavily played game or series up to this point in terms of ones that they have became victorious in. And in those, they look kind of shaky on rotations and hardpoint. They just don't seem to be all there, and I worry maybe in the future about the lack of online leadership. Where does that come from? The SMGs at times have been inconsistent. However, like I said, it just kind of all relies upon how they improve for the future. Also, one major plus that has really taken them down a major notch is domination. This was a team that earlier on in the season looked fantastic on gun runner domination. They start off the season 5-0. You know how many times they've played it since they went 5-0? Zero. No one wants to play them on it. And that has been their biggest problem, is not relying on that swing game 3 domination a majority of the time, which was played on Gunrunner. So this team, like I said, I think has the ability to project upwards, also has the ability to go down maybe a little bit as well, depending on how a few teams do. Speaking of one of those teams, New York Subliners. This is a team that at the start of the year was projected to be far higher than this, right? This was a team that many people had in their top 5, but clearly they were not in a great state. Roster changes have obviously been a major talking point for them, whether they want to make the news or not. They have been, with talks of Sensor maybe being added in the starting lineup, the odd addition of someone like Happy, who hasn't played on a main stage since 2017. How does that start to factor in? And I will say I do worry in some ways about the future of accuracy and his ability to be the main AR, because based on stats, he hasn't looked great. Do you kind of blame that on the SMG side of things, or do you kind of blame that on the main AR? I think it can kind of go both ways, but I haven't loved what I've seen from him. I feel like a lot of main ARs, despite maybe a lack of SMG presence, have still been able to put up very, very good numbers. But I like the move of bringing in a young talent like Mac. I think a decent amount of weight does now fall on his shoulders to be a consistent slayer for him. They're bringing this guy in for a reason, and now you kind of have this interesting element of kind of 4 guys who like to play at a faster pace, right? You have Zuma, you have Attach, you have Temp, and now you have Mac. I'm excited to see how this element works out. It's almost definite that he's going to be in that starting lineup, and due to a little bit of gameplay that I've been able to watch, I've been pretty impressed with what I've got to see. But we haven't seen anything yet from them. It's hard to have them higher because we have not watched them play very much at all. Next, and finally, we're going to talk about the Los Angeles Guerrillas. I'm telling you right now, don't sleep on Aches coming back. He holds a lot of cards right now, from salary to bringing up the point of a young team needing leadership. He has had a 3-week period to talk with management at LAG to really zone in on the losses that they had and the ones that they suffered as well. I think Guerrillas made a risky move, right? They absolutely did, bringing in 3 players. That was the biggest roster change, one-time roster change that we have seen so far throughout this year. And obviously, we're close to beating OGLA, but still, they look sloppy throughout the remainder of their tournament. You talk about the composure factor to be up versus OGLA like that. You like to see them close that out. It was a lot of new guys kind of coming in Vivid and Spart. And I like the pieces that they added, and I think that Vivid and Spark can be useful pieces. But I really am under the impression that this is not the last time that we see Aches. I think he makes his way back to the LAG team at some point. Because like I said, 3 weeks, it's a long time. You're dwelling on a loss of which you didn't win any series when it came down to the most recent event. And I think that they're going to dwell on that enough to think, hey, it's time that we add in an older veteran, a guy who can kind of add a lot to the team in terms of communication. Whether you agree with that or not, hey, it's up to you, but I think that that probably will take place. Again, those are just where my current rankings lie, solely taking into consideration opinion and not on stats. That is just where I personally see and rank teams, at least as of right now, coming into the online league. But it was a great show today, right? We covered a lot of ground in regard to FaZe's recent loss in LA, how that affects their mentality moving forward, how these COVID-19 has affected the league and the precaution that needs to take place, along with the steps that also could follow suit. But we'll see you all same time, same place, right here on EnvyTV, Friday, following Contested at 5 p.m. Central Time. Take it easy, folks. Stay safe and enjoy your week.